You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Hello, welcome to Indications. I'm Elizabeth Crofoot, Senior Economist at the Conference Board. You're listening to the U.S. Labor Market Roundup, our monthly podcast series where our labor market experts give you their reading of the latest jobs report released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and then provide insights on a special labor market topic. Today we'll react to the July jobs report, and in light of the COVID-19 related lockdowns, we'll discuss the rise of telework and its long-term impact after COVID-19. Today I'm joined by three of my esteemed colleagues. First, Gad Levanon, head of our Labor Markets Institute. Gad is a foremost expert on U.S. labor markets and of forecasting the U.S. economy. He is an avid blogger on labor market topics and is a regular contributor in Forbes. I'm also joined by Frank Steemers, economist at the Conference Board. Frank is one of our primary researchers focusing on U.S. and global labor markets and is one of the main authors of a recent report on human capital responses to COVID-19. And a most special welcome to Amy Abel, Vice President of Human Capital Research at the Conference Board. Most recently, Amy has been leading research efforts around practitioner challenges and responses to COVID, especially related to remote work and its impacts on leadership, talent management, and employee engagement. Frank, Gad, and Amy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Great, thanks for being here. So let's dive right into the July jobs report numbers. So we heard from the BLS that in July we gained 1.8 million jobs, and that's much better than was expected. Unemployment also declined to 10.2% from 11.1% in June and 13.3% in May. So we're definitely on a downward trend. Overall, we did see more industries are gaining jobs than losing them. We saw some strong gains in industries where workers are being recalled to their jobs as states allow more businesses to operate again. So in food services and drinking places, retail trade, especially clothing stores, government also saw some strong job gains as census jobs were opened up, but those are temporary jobs by their nature. Also some gains, strong gains in professional and business services and healthcare. There were some slightly weaker gains in manufacturing and construction, however, and some industry losses, most notably in the information sector and in wholesale trade. And we're still seeing some large disparities in unemployment as well. Whites had an unemployment rate of 9.2% versus blacks at 14.6%. Men saw unemployment rate at 9.4% versus women at 10.5%. So there's still these underlying disparities in the way that COVID-19 is affecting labor market outcomes for different demographic groups. And really to put all of this in perspective, although we saw some really good headline numbers last month, we're moving in the right direction, we still have a really long way to go. Compared to February before COVID-19 hit, we have lost 22 million jobs at the height of the lockdowns in April, and we haven't even gained half of those jobs back. We still are 13 million below those February levels. So one of the main takeaways here is that the pace of job gains and the recovery is slowing, and we're still in a weak labor market amidst the worst recession since the Great Depression. So with that setup in mind, I really want to turn to our panel of experts and discuss some of the observations that really came out in terms of what we should be paying attention to with this jobs report. Frank, I'll turn to you first. Can you tell us something that really came out to you in this jobs report?
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. I think you already shared many of the main insights from the jobs report. So let me focus on one topic that I thought was very interesting and which has actually already been interesting over the last several months since the outbreak of COVID-19, and that is to understand what has been driving the unemployment rate up from February to April, and then down again from April to July. So often we talk about the unemployment rate and just look at the large group, the unemployed. But the unemployed, you can actually divide into three larger groups. For example, the people who are furloughed, so who are temporarily laid off, those that are permanently laid off, and then there's another larger group of entrants, re-entrants, or people who are completing their temporary job. So what I want to do in this, what I thought was very interesting, is to look at these first two groups and to see that actually the unemployment rate, the increase from February to April to 14.7% and then down again, that is actually entirely driven or almost entirely driven by the changes in the people who are furloughed. So we know that this crisis is very different than previous recessions, and we can also see that in these trends because, for example, in the Great Recession, the share of people who were furloughed, so temporarily laid off, did actually not even increase that much. But in this recession, you see that almost all the changes are people being furloughed and then being recalled back to work. And when you look at that second group, so those who are permanently laid off, there has actually only been a very small increase in that group since February. So I think that is interesting, again, pointing out the difference of this crisis versus other recessions, but also to use this and think about the next months, because we know it is now about 5 months after the big lockdowns in many states and in many cities. And we know that companies are now downsizing, some are maybe going bankrupt. We know that, or we expect that economic activity might actually slow down. Now we know that some states have been pausing their reopening plans or have even reversed them. So as a result, some furloughed workers may actually not be recalled back to work anymore. So maybe the share of furloughs will still go down over the coming months, but they will not be going into employment, but actually start to fall under those permanently laid off. And so over the next months, we expect that there will be more balance and going more towards a more normal recession that we have seen in the past. And lastly, I think it can tell us a lot about how tight or maybe how loose the labor market is right now. And I think that Gad has a lot of interesting information to share about that topic.
Right, Gad, maybe you can share some of the implications that such a high temporary layoffs have on the ability of employers to find qualified applicants.
Right. So what we're seeing now in the labor market is, on the one hand, a very high unemployment rate, historically high. But and typically a very high unemployment rate means that there are a lot of job seekers competing over a small number of job openings. And that's why it's very difficult typically for job seekers to find a job, and it's very easy for employers to find a worker under such conditions. But this time is very different. So even though we have a very high unemployment rate, it's actually not that difficult to find a job right now, and it's not so easy for employers to find workers. In fact, in our consumer confidence survey, we have only 20% of people who are saying the jobs are hard to get now, versus about 50% that said that during the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. So there is a kind of a disconnect between the unemployment rate and how difficult it is to actually find work. And I think there's one big reason for that, and that is, despite the large number of unemployed, only a relatively small share of them are seriously looking for work. And that's for four main reasons. One of them, Frank discussed, that a lot of those people believe that they are temporarily laid off or furloughed, and their old job is waiting for them. So then they are not actively looking for a job. Another reason is childcare. A lot of parents, especially women, I just cannot go back to the labor market because they need to take care of their kids. So they're also not searching that seriously for a job. There's also a lot of people who are afraid of getting COVID, so they're also not seriously looking for a job. And finally, until the end of July, the unemployment benefits were extremely generous in the US, and that also on the margins may have impacted some workers or some unemployed people from seriously looking for a job, because they, in many cases, actually 2/3 of the unemployed got a higher income when they did not work than when they did work. Now, that may change because a lot of the people who, for example, were on furloughs and waiting to get their job, they will actually realize, probably the large majority of them at this point will soon realize that there is no job waiting for them. We expect employment to grow very little from now on. So those people will go back to look for a job very seriously. And also the unemployment benefits, they are already the $600 were already in the first week of August. People are not entitled to them anymore. It was not extended. And we'll have to wait and see what happens to the unemployment rates, the unemployment benefits moving forward. Elizabeth, since you're living in the DC area, maybe you have some geographical insight on what will happen to the unemployment benefits moving forward.
Right. So we do know that the president signed an executive order in this past week to extend those supplemental unemployment benefits at a reduced rate of $400 per week. So that is less than the $600 that you just mentioned. And of those $400, $300 is guaranteed by the federal government, and states are responsible for the remaining $100, but their regular unemployment insurance benefit can count as that $100 match. So effectively, the extension would cut the previous $600 a week benefit in half. So it definitely puts unemployed workers in a different position that they were before, and they were gaining additional income with that government support. So yeah, these are some really interesting topics that have come out of this last jobs report. Like I said, we're in the midst of some of the most difficult labor market situations for many groups of people, and we'll be keeping an eye out on following jobs reports to see how this situation evolves, especially as policy starts to change incentives in terms of the labor market and employment outlook. So I think this is a good time for a break, and we're going to stop for some announcements from the conference board.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
Hello, we're back. This is Indications, and we were just talking about the July jobs report. We're now going to shift to our special topic on the rise of telework after COVID-19. So the old news is that this pandemic has forced organizations to pivot to remote working at lightning speed, and we're all living that reality now. Today, we want to take a longer-term view of the situation. If working from home is here to stay, who's going to be doing it, and how can companies respond to some of the challenges around managing remote workers? And luckily, we have Amy and Gad here to help us sort through some of these issues. So, Gad, I'll turn to you first. How big is remote work going to be when this pandemic is over? And what are the occupations that we think are more likely to stick with this remote working model in the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think this could be the main legacy, the main economic and work-related legacy of COVID-19. It's very hard to forecast that full impact, but all indications suggest that many more people will work primarily from home after the pandemic is over. Compared to the pre-pandemic period. Just in a survey that we did in April, only 3% said that 3% of companies said that 40% or more of their workers primarily work from home, but 19% expect that to happen after the pandemic. So we're going to see it will become much more normal for many workers to work primarily from home. We did also a survey of individuals themselves, and we also see a large increase in although not as large as employer themselves, but many more individuals expect to work primarily from home after the pandemic is over. Now, of course, it's not going to be across all occupations in the same way. In many of the blue-collar occupations, it's impossible to work remotely. A lot of white-collar occupations like medical doctors and teachers, it will, although the current during the current pandemic, a lot of teachers did teach remotely, but it's probably, especially in before college, in elementary schools and even high schools, it's probably not going to be the case moving forward. But it was very popular in some occupations even before the pandemic. So, for example, almost 10% of workers, full-time employees in computer-related occupations worked primarily from home in 2018, and it was a big jump from the earlier decade. So there has been a strong trend in computer-related occupation, business and financial-related occupations, a strong increase over there. So those are probably the types of occupations and jobs that lend themselves to remote work, and those are the ones that were likely to see a big increase. There's another interesting occupation or group of occupations. Those are the more office and administrative support, clerical workers that are done in an office but typically do not require a BA. Relatively few of them worked remotely or primarily from home before the recession, before the COVID, partly because many of them are hourly workers or non-exempt workers, so they are entitled to overtime pay, and employers needed to carefully monitor how many hours they work, which is easier in an office setting. So they were less willing to let those workers work primarily from home. But COVID completely changed that, because for a while we all had to work from home. And so this obstacle is removed. And we have some indication, especially from online job ads, that those clerical administrative support workers are seeing a very large increase in the share of the occupation that is working primarily from home. So that may be an important trend moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, definitely this monumental shift to remote work has implications not only for workers, but also for the companies that have to change their way of managing workers and the way they, collaborate with them. Amy, from a human capital perspective, what are some of the top challenges that companies are going to be facing now?
Thanks, Elizabeth. It's a really great question. And as you know, and given the stats that Gad was just talking about, we all know that companies have basically been turned upside down over the last few months in this pandemic. Right? Many organizations had some workers working remotely, but now many organizations have a majority of their workforce working remotely, especially in the office professional roles. And so it really is completely different in how we all used to do work. And so, of course, this poses a lot of challenges to organizations. And what I'm hearing from a lot of the executives and the companies that I'm talking to, three main challenges that let me briefly summarize today. One is around how do we collaborate and build work relationships together? We're all used to meeting together in the office or having coffee chats or, having lunches together. All of that are conducive to how we collaborate with each other in teams and how we build working relationships, how we even have conversations with each other or brainstorm ideas together. And it's not that we can't do that today, obviously, but as we all know, all through Zoom meetings, it's not as spontaneous and everything has to be scheduled and we're all over Zoomed out anyways, right? So it's really difficult for organizations to figure out how do we continue to help build and build these relationships so that teams and colleagues can collaborate effectively. Now, connected to that is the second item around leadership challenges and managers. Leaders do not know, many of them struggle with how to lead virtually. How do you manage teams virtually? How do you give feedback virtually? How do you have development and coaching conversations virtually? And so these are all new behaviors, new skills that we're not used to, or most leaders are not used to. And so definitely executives are struggling. Well, how do we do this? How do we do this in the context of the business that is completely turned upside down? How do we do this in a societal change of a pandemic? And also, how do we do this with, sort of some of the societal changes and issues that we have in the US, for example, the civil unrest that we're experiencing, right? Where leaders have to have these conversations that sometimes are very difficult to have, but it's all virtual and they are struggling with that. And then finally, sort of related to all of the two items that I just mentioned, the mental health and overall well-being of employees is something that has completely risen to the top of the list for what companies are thinking about, wanting to address, and are very concerned about. And this is obviously all workers, all leaders, all managers, whether they're frontline employees or not frontline employees, the overall well-being and safety, of course, but then the mental health, right? This has been a very, very stressful period. There are lots of stats out there around how stressful. Some professionals are saying that this is like something like 7 in 10 executives will say this is the most stressful period of their professional lives ever, right? And there's so many reasons for that. Everything from, working remotely to parenting challenges, homeschooling challenges, right? All of these craziness that is going on in our lives. And the stress level is very high for many employees. And so this is a great concern for companies. And I think this is a good thing. I mean, companies were already concerned about the mental health and well-being of their employees, but COVID has basically kicked it up 10 notches. And now companies are really addressing it a lot more seriously.
Thanks, Amy. I think that a lot of what you're talking about in terms of how companies are valuing and approaching collaboration and leadership is really reflective in some of the models that they're choosing in terms of implementing remote work. So, for example, there are companies like Twitter and Facebook that have announced that their workers can work from home forever. And their offices will eventually reopen very cautiously, but that gives an insight into how these companies are collaborating online, perhaps more effectively than others. And then there are other companies such as Apple that have a very high interest in keeping physical office space, especially because Apple likes to develop hardware behind closed doors and is very secretive about it. And other companies like Box, for example, values fostering relationships and mentorship and networking and innovation, and all of those things they feel can be better done if there's an in-person connection. So those companies, for example, are really looking to having more of a hybrid space where workers are still working from home part of the time, but are coming in to the office. And I would say that a lot of companies right now are somewhere in the middle of all of that. A lot of companies have announced that they're extending their remote work policies at least to the end of the year until they get a sense of how the virus is going to play out next year. So this is really the buying time approach that is allowing them to develop policies for how workers are going to return to the physical workspace, for example, setting up social distance workstations, deep cleaning protocols, how workers are going to enter and exit the building and go up and down elevators. That buys them time while workers are still at home to develop some of those other approaches and strategies for how workers can come back to the office. But overall,
but you know what?
Oh, go ahead.
You know what, Elizabeth? Though everything you just said is it's right on. That only increases the complexity of the challenges that I just summarized. Right? The fact that whether you're remote, not remote, hybrid, not hybrid, how are leaders supposed to lead in that? How are they supposed to know how to figure out how to effectively guide their teams, right? And if you're hybrid, sometimes in the office, not in the office, how are teams supposed to respond to that and collaborate? So I think this is exactly right. This is what many organizations are doing and trying and experimenting, but it only increases the complexity of all of that and this well-being and overall safety, right? I mean, it just makes it very chaotic, even more so perhaps.
Right. And I think adding to that complexity is this question that you can work from home from anywhere, especially if you're working for a Facebook or a Twitter and your employer says, we're not expected to come back to the office for a full year. That gives you a lot of flexibility to move around geographically as well. And Gad, I'll turn to you now. If we're really in this for the long haul in terms of working from home, what kind of geographical implications are there for where we work and live and, consume?
Yeah, no, I think that would be a major trend moving forward. Because a lot of and the areas that will be impacted mostly are the city centers or areas where a lot of people come for work. Because if the rate of remote working increases, then people will not come to city centers, or fewer people will come to city centers for work. And they will also do a lot, those people who are not in city centers for work, they will also not shop, they will not go to the dentist there, they will not have lunches and happy hours. So I think city centers will be significantly impacted by that economically. Also, the demand for retail and office space in city centers will decline significantly. I think real estate prices will drop there. But in other areas, those things that people used to do in city centers when they work there, they are now going to do in other places. So we may see an increase in demand for retail and office, for retail, especially in areas outside of city centers. It may also have an impact on where people decide to live. If you lived close to city center because you wanted a short commute, now you may prefer to live further away from city center and get a bigger bang for the buck in terms of housing space. So we already, in New York, I hear a lot of people I know who live around in suburbs of New York City that they say that their housing markets are booming. So maybe that we will see that as well.
Right. So we've heard a lot of information today about remote work, how it's going to impact not only how managers lead and collaborate with their workers, also how we as workers choose where to live, where to consume, where to buy our goods and services. It's all really going to make dramatic shifts in the demand overall. So I think that's all we have time for today in terms of our discussion on remote work. So we'll stop there. This has been a really great conversation with Gad Levanon and Frank Steemers and Amy Abel about the July jobs report and the rise of telework after COVID-19. Gad, Frank, and Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. Please join us next month for the U.S. Labor Markets Roundup, where we'll be discussing the August jobs report and trends in wages and salary increase budgets. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to Indications. You can find this program and several others from the Conference Board on our website or through your favorite podcast app. Thanks again for listening. I'm Elizabeth Crofoot with the Conference Board.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.